Hello everyone, so today I'm going to be exploring the concept of race, and not just as a social phenomenon, but as something that's very deeply rooted in philosophy. I will be examining how race has been constructed historically and how it influences our notions of justice, and how philosophy, both ancient and modern, can help us rethink race and address the inequalities it causes. I'm also going to include a real-life case study, which was an affirmative action case, to see how these philosophical ideas about race play into that society. My goal of this video is to demonstrate that race isn't just a social category, it's a philosophical issue that impacts our understanding of justice, knowledge, and reality itself. So I'm going to start with two authors who both primarily focus on race in their work, and they challenge us to rethink how race is understood. That is Neil Gotanda on the right and Sally Haslinger on the left. Both of their works provides a foundation for understanding race, not as just a biological fact, but as more of a social construct. In Neil Gotanda's essay, he critiques the idea of colorblind constitutionalism, which he's basically saying the best way to address racial inequality is to simply stop thinking about race. The colorblind approach that he has assumes that if the law treats everyone equally, regardless of their race, racial inequality will disappear. But Gotanda also argues that this approach fails to acknowledge the realities of racial injustice. He's saying that by pretending that race doesn't matter, we are just ignoring the historical and social forces that have perpetuated inequality in our social system. Gotanda's work ties into Haslinger's work in her article because Haslinger argues that race is a social construct and it's not inherent or biological characteristics of individuals. Instead, race is a category created by society, shaped by power structures and historical processes. She argues that it's very important to understand that race is something that has been constructed over time, and that it has tangible consequences for a lot of people's lives. So basically, both Gotanda and Haslinger tell us that race is not some objective truth that exists independently of society. Rather, it's a socially constructed category, which was shaped by historical power dynamics. This is very important because it leads us to understand that racial inequality cannot be solved by simply just ignoring race. We need to confront it directly in both legal and social frameworks and settings. Now moving on to some more ancient philosophy, George Klosko's Racism in Plato's Republic, we can see that in the foundations of the Western philosophy, the ideas about justice were racially exclusionary, and Plato's Republics out a vision of justice where each person has a role in society, but these roles are heavily limited by ethnicity and culture. Plato also argues that only the Greeks are fit to rule and live in a just society. Klosko argues in his work that Plato's ideas about justice are racially exclusionary, as they imply that non-Greek people were inferior and not deserving of the same treatment or rights. While Plato's ideas on justice have been hugely influential, Klosko reminds us that race, even in ancient philosophy, was a very big factor in determining who deserved justice and who didn't. This even slightly can tie into Gotanda's critique of colorblindness by if Plato's ideal society was built on the exclusion of non-Greeks, then we can see the concept of justice in Western philosophy has been racialized from its very inception. And this legacy does continue today, and if we do not acknowledge the ways in which racial exclusions have shaped our ideas of justice, then we can't really move forward in creating a truly equitable society. The next author that I chose was Bertrand Russell, and I'm going to be focusing on his essay called Appearance and Reality. Russell usually stays on the topic of epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, so I'm going to see how that can tie into race. Appearance in reality addresses the tension between how things appear to us and what they actually are. Russell argues that our perception of the world is not necessarily how the world really is. This distinction between appearance and reality is crucial when thinking about race. What we see, a person's skin color or physical features, may lead us to immediately make assumptions about who they are or what they offer. But again, these assumptions are based on social constructs. Immanuel Kant takes this idea even further in his Critique of Pure Reason. Kant basically says that the world as we experience it is shaped by the categories our minds impose on it. This can very much include how we perceive race. Kant also argues that we can never know things in their pure objective reality, only how they appear to us, filtered through the categories of our understanding. If race is a category we can impose upon people, then it's definitely a concept shaped by our historical and social context rather than the property of individuals. Together, both Russell and Kant's ideas show us that the way we perceive race, or the way that we categorize people based on their external features, is not an immutable truth, but a socially constructed appearance. Since the perceptions of race are shaped by social norms and cultural categories, they're not fixed, which means we do have the ability to rethink and reshape how we categorize people and the meanings that we can attach to those categories that we make of people. For example, the idea of colorblindness, which is the notion that we should ignore race entirely in decision making, might seem like a way of addressing racial equality, but philosophers like Neil Gotanda, we keep going back to him, have shown that ignoring race often fails to address the systematic inequalities that race has historically represented. Gotanda even argues that a colorblind approach can perpetuate racial injustice by not acknowledging the lived experiences and historical realities that are tied to race. If race is a social construct, like both Russell and Kant suggest, then we have the agency to reimagine what race means and how we construct our societies around it. We can do this by challenging the old racial categories and thinking about race in new ways that move beyond simplistic, superficial markers of difference and instead focus on the shared humanity of all people. The shifting understanding of race from fixed biological categories to rather socially constructed categories means that we, the people, have the capacity to change our perceptions, which can lead into a change in the way that we categorize people and the systems that these categorizations support. Basically, the ideas of both Russell and Kant both give us powerful tools for understanding that race, as we perceive it, is not an inherent feature of the world, but more of a social construct that we create through our own perceptions and mental categories that we've developed on our own. These perceptions are not objective truths, but rather reflections of the cultural, historical, and social context in which we live in. Because these categories are not fixed, we have the ability to change them, which means that race, as we understand it, can be reimagined in a way and reconstructed to create a more just society. Altogether, this can offer an ounce of hope. By rethinking race in philosophical terms, we can sort of transform how we understand human diversity and slowly move forward towards an equitable world where racial justice is not perpetuated by the categories that we've created. Okay, for my case study, I'm going to take a look at a real-world example of how these philosophical debates about race play out in society. Affirmative action is a policy designed to address racial inequalities by giving preferential treatment to the underrepresented racial minorities in areas like college admissions and hiring. This debate around affirmative action often centers on whether race should be considered in decision making. On one side, there's the supporters that argue that because race is a socially constructed category that impacts people's lives, it needs to be considered in policies that are aimed at correcting historical injustice. But on the other side, there's critics that argue that policies like affirmative action violate the principle of treating people as individuals and that we should adopt the colorblind approach where race is ignored. This is where, once again, Gotanda's critique of colorblindness comes in. Basically, if we do adopt a colorblind approach, as some critics of affirmative action suggest, we ignore the deep historical and structural inequalities that race has caused. Gotanda argues that pretending race doesn't exist won't entirely solve racial inequality, it will simply just perpetuate it like normal. Now, taking a look at the 2016 Supreme Court case Fisher versus University of Texas. Abigail Fisher, a white woman, argued that she was denied admission to the University of Texas because of her race, claiming that the university's use of race in admissions decisions was discriminatory. The court then had to decide whether race-conscious admissions policies were constitutional. Fisher's case widely brings the philosophical debate into sharp focus. I mean, is it fair to consider race in admissions, or should we treat everyone equally regardless of their race? That's pretty obvious. Among this case, we can see and clarify the tension between colorblindness, which Gotanda critiques, and the need to confront racial inequalities head-on. The affirmative action here is a direct response to these inequalities. Basically, acknowledging that race has real consequences for multiple people's lives and their opportunities. This case is a clear example to show how philosophical debates about race manifest in real-world legal and social contexts. So, what can we learn from this? Basically, Gotanda and Haslinger, we see that race is not a biological fact. It is a social construct shaped by the power structures and history. Klosko's analysis of Plato reminds us that ideas about justice have been racialized from the very beginning of Western philosophy. Like this little ancient Greece scene right here. Also wanted to show this colorblind lady to represent the colorblind critique that Gotanda has. Russell and Kant teach us that our perceptions of race are not objective truths, rather they are socially constructed appearances that we can change. And when we look at the case study of affirmative action, we see how these philosophical ideas play out in real life. Affirmative action is an attempt to correct racial injustices, but it's deeply contested because of the conflicting ideas about what justice means and whether we should consider race in our pursuit of equality. Ultimately, these 5 texts do show us that race is a philosophical issue, not just a social one. To further address racial inequality, we need to engage with these philosophical questions about justice, knowledge, and reality. We can't just simply ignore race, because doing so would ignore the real consequences of racial equality. Instead, we need to confront race head-on, and that is in both theory and practice. So, thank you for listening. I hope that this video has helped you think more deeply about how race intersects with philosophy. Race is not just something we see, it's something we can understand through philosophical lenses. I encourage everyone to reflect on these ideas and think about how they apply to the real world around us. Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching and have a Merry Christmas.